All right. All right. This week we are dealing with solving quadratics. And I will tell you that you should have learned this stuff already in Algebra 1, okay? I'm just going to put it out there. Some of you guys are going to say, I learned a lot in Algebra 1, blah, 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 blah. All right, that's beside the point. But what we're going to do is I'm going to review right now what's going to be on the assessment and the practice. And you have to be able to solve a quadratic. But I will tell you that some of your answers tonight are going to end up being like they'll come out to be a negative square root. Well, that doesn't mean that there's no answer, right? That means it's just going to be imaginary. So we're going to use some of the stuff that we learned last week with what we're going to be dealing with this week, okay? So it's going to go back to last week's. So the first thing that we're going to do this week is we're going to be learning how to solve a quadratic using square roots, okay? For example, if I gave you a problem like, let's say I gave you something like, let me change this a little bit. Let's say I gave you something like, let's go just x squared plus 25 is equal to 0. And I asked you to solve this quadratic, okay? It's like, okay, usually a quadratic has 3 terms. But if there's no x term, for example, something like, we're so used to solving things like this, x squared plus 7x plus 10 is equal to 0. Then we would factor this or do the completing the square or do the quadratic formula, we could solve this. But if it doesn't have this middle term here, then you can usually solve. And Macy, I'm going to say you're close, but you're not correct. I would not take that as an answer. That is not correct. And I'll show you why. When we subtract, we're going to subtract 25 off of this side. We want to get the x squared by itself, okay? So then I'd end up with x squared is equal to negative 25. Uh-oh, this is starting to look like last week. We're going to have, yes, there's going to be an I in our answer. That is absolutely correct. So when we take the square root of both sides, we're going to end up with x equals plus or minus 5i. So my answer is going to be 5i or negative 5i. Why do I know there's 2 answers to my problem? How do we know that? Yeah, it's quadratic. The highest power always tells you how many solutions there will be. This is an x to the second, which is quadratic, which means that there's 2 solutions. Now, they're not always going to be real solutions. For example, this one is not a real solution. This one has 2 imaginary solutions. And it's 5i and negative 5i. But there are 2 solutions. They're just not real solutions. They're imaginary. Oh, we'll definitely have powers higher than 2. Yes. And then that means there'll be 3 solutions or 4 solutions or something like that. You betcha. Yep, this is Algebra 2. We're going to go on to higher powers. All right, so quadratic. Okay, let me do one other problem here before we move on. Let's say I gave you something like this, and this might not turn out real nice because I'm just making it up as I go. Okay, let's say I gave you 2x squared plus 32 is equal to 0. In order to solve a quadratic, in order to use method, we have to isolate the x squared before we can solve, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to subtract 32, right? We're going to isolate the x squared. Okay, so that leaves me with 2x squared is equal to negative 32. Then I'm going to divide through by 2 because I want to get x squared all by itself. So I end up with x squared is equal to negative 16. Now I have x squared by itself. So now I can take the square root of both sides. And if I take the square root of both sides, I end up with x equals plus or minus 4i. That is exactly correct. So a little bit of last week is coming back in our solutions this week. Oh no, Mr. Shanklin, you can't use last week's material. Yes, I can. All right. Now the second method that we're going to be using this week, and I will tell you on the assessment, the first problem has like 2 or 3 questions, and it asks you to use the square root method to solve. You must use that method. When you show your work, you have to use this method. The second problem on this week, which there's 2 or 3 problems, it asks the square. You have to use completing the square in order to solve. If you don't, you will not get credit. Okay? So I'm just putting it out there. You have to use the method that I ask for. You can't just use the quadratic formula for everything. Okay, so how do we do this type of problem? All right, so if I gave you a problem like this, let's say I gave you x squared. I want to make sure this turns out. So okay, so x squared plus 8x plus 12 is equal to 0. Okay, and we're going to use completing the square. Okay. Yes, on the summative, it's all like problem number 1, you got to use the first method. Problem number 2, you have to use completing the square, and problem number 3, you have to use quadratic formula. Okay. So now completing the square, first thing I do is I always tell the kids get the whole number off that side. Okay, so I'm going to rewrite this as x squared plus 8x is equal to negative 12. Okay, that would be my first step. Second step, I'm going to add something to both sides. I don't know what I'm going to add yet, but I'm just going to write it down. So 8x plus, or x squared plus 8x plus something is equal to negative 12 plus something. I'm going to add the same thing to both sides, because if you add a number to both sides, it doesn't change the problem. Why am I going to add 16? I agree with you guys. I'm going to add 16. Okay, why? Because you always take half of this number. So half of the middle term. So half of 8 is 4 squared. So I'm going to add 16 here. I'm going to add 16 here. Why did I do that? Because when I factor this, it makes this a perfect trinomial square. What does that mean? Well, remember when we used to factor, we used to always ask ourselves what 2 numbers multiply to give us 16, the last number, but add up to the middle number? Well, 4 times 4 is equal to 16. 4 plus 4 is 8. So this is going to be x plus 4, x plus 4. It will always turn out to be the exact same thing. So this, I'm going to have you guys write it this way. X plus 4 squared is equal to negative 12 plus 16, which is 4. Okay. Now, we're not done yet. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. This is completing the square. Okay, so we just completed the square. We still have to solve. Okay, now remember, the last type of problem that we said we had to isolate the square. Well, it's inside parentheses, so this is isolated. So now I can take the square root of both sides. So I'm going to take the square root of this side. I'm going to take the square root of this side. What happens when I take the square root of this side? I'm left with x plus 4. Okay? Is equal to 2. But it's equal to 2, and it also is equal to negative 2. When we take the square root of both sides, it becomes positive and negative. So I just write it as 2 separate problems. So now I'm going to subtract 4. So I end up with x equals negative 2. I'm going to subtract 4. I end up with x equals negative 6. Oh, look at that. I end up with my 2 solutions. Ah, Samantha, that is a great analogy, that it's almost like absolute values. Yes, it is. You have to, all math is like that. You have to isolate before you love it. That is a great analogy. It is like absolute values. We got to isolate it. Awesome. And you have to write it as 2 equations. Very good. Yes, I love it. That is a great analogy. All right. So now we have 2 different ways of solving a quadratic, and then the last one is a quadratic formula. So let's use the same problem that we just worked on. Okay. We just did x squared plus 8x plus 16, right, is equal to 0. Remember, it has to be equal to 0 in order for you to solve. We're going to use the quadratic formula. Hopefully we get the same answer. Okay, so my a value is 1, my b value is 8, my c value is 16. So I'm just going to plug it into this formula, negative b. So 8 negative, so that's going to be negative 8 plus or minus the square root of b squared. Well, 8 squared is 64 minus 4 times a times c. I always write that off to the side so I can multiply it out. So 16 times 4 is 64, is it? Uh-oh, that's kind of weird. And then over 2 times a, which is just 2 times 1. 64 minus 64 is 0, isn't it? So I end up with negative 8 plus or minus 0, because the square root of 0 is 0 over 2. So now I'm going to write this as two different problems. I'm going to write it as negative 8 plus 0 over 2, or negative 8 minus 0 over 2. Well, negative 8 plus 0 is negative 8 divided by 2. That's negative 4. And negative 8 minus 0, uh-oh, something's wrong here. Why is it wrong? Because I'm not getting the same answer as all right. This was the same problem that we, it was negative 4 and negative 4, wasn't it? On the last one? Uh-huh. All right. So, quadratic formula is fairly easy to use also. But remember, tonight, you might end up with a negative inside here. So let's say we ended up with negative 8 plus or minus the square root of negative 16 over 2. Let's say that's what we ended up with. Well, then you would just write your answer like this. You would just go negative 8 plus or minus 4i over 2, and you can just leave it like that. You'll understand that there's two answers because it's plus or minus. What if the radical is irrational? What do you mean by irrational? Oh, that it doesn't turn out to be a nice number? Just leave it then. Now, if you end up with like square root of 37, just leave it. Okay? It doesn't matter. Yeah. I'm gonna go back to my previous slide, but no, it was a different problem. I used 12 instead of 16. That's why. It was two different. That's why. My first problem was x squared plus 8x plus 12. This time I did x squared plus. That's why we didn't end up with the same thing. All right. It's called old age. Sometimes don't remember things. All right. Here's our Desmos presentation for today. Let's jump into that and go through all of the problems from this week, okay, on the practice. So I am going to, I've got to share that with you guys. So let me share that and you guys jump in there. Okay, let's see, I need to share this. Gotta remember how to do this. Oh, I gotta pick which one I want. I want that one. Okay, so now I'm on slide number 3, okay? I'm just gonna jump in here and see how many people are in Desmos right now. Oh, there we go, awesome. Not everybody, but we have a good portion of people in here. So number 3, it doesn't tell us how to solve, okay? The practice, it really makes no difference which way you solve. So I don't care in the practice. I mean, obviously, if I was going to do this practice problem, I'm not going to use completing the square. I'm not going to use quadratic formula. I'm just going to go x squared is equal to 225. X is equal to the square root plus or minus the square root of 225. And the square root of 225 is 15, isn't it? So x equals plus or minus 15. So I would go with letter D for that one. Okay. So that, and on the practice, I don't care what method you use, unless it tells you specifically which one to use. Doesn't really matter. Which letter is going to be the most popular this week? Yeah, last week, wasn't it all A's? I wouldn't, Samantha. On the assessment, I will. But on the practice, you can do it any way you want. You know, some people, they just sit through the practice and find all the answers and they don't do any of the work, which is perfectly fine. I mean, it is set up that way. But, you know, if you come to the main lesson, you might as well do the problems, right? Might as well. What the heck? All right, let's go to problem number 2. I'm going to let you guys work on this one a little bit. It's a little tricky. It's not really difficult. But I'm going to let you guys work on this one. It's x minus the quantity x minus 14 squared is equal to 36. Okay. see what you get for an answer. When you do get an answer, please put it into the text box, and then I'll know once there's a few answers in there that will go on. I may be missing something. You're suspicious of B and C? I'm suspicious of A and D, okay? The reason I'm suspicious of A and D is because there's only one answer. Now, obviously, there can be one answer. I mean, it could be -4, -4. It could be that. But usually when you have a quadratic, you end up with two answers, right? So I'm kind of suspicious of A and D right off the bat. I would be looking at it thinking, I'm probably not going to pick A or D. But some people are. All right, let's do the problem. Is the variable isolated? That's the first question you have to ask. Okay, is the variable isolated? And a lot of kids, they say no, but the answer is yes. The square is isolated because it's inside parentheses. We have x minus 14. It's inside the parentheses, so that is isolated. Now, if there was like a 2 on the outside, we'd have to get rid of this 2. If there was like a +4 here, I'd have to get rid of this +4. But everything inside this parenthesis is to the second power, so we have to get rid of everything on the outside, but there wasn't anything on the outside. So, oops, sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. So x minus 14 is equal to 36. It is isolated, so I can take the square root of both sides. So if I take the square root of both sides, I end up with x minus 14 is equal to +6. And then I'm going to go x minus 14 is equal to -6, because it's positive and negative. So now if I add 14 to both sides, I end up with x equals 20. If I add 14 to both sides here, I end up with x equals, is that 8? So 8 and 20 seem like the correct answer. Does that make sense? I know some of you were struggling with that problem in the beginning. Does that make sense? Okay, now remember, Samantha, since it's an x squared, you really should be looking for two answers in there. Yeah, and that's why coming to the help sessions, or the main lesson, awesome. Now, is there anybody here today? Why not parentheses first? Do you mean, could you square it out? Could you do x minus 14 times x minus 14? You absolutely could, but I think what you're asking for is some trouble, because x minus 14 squared really means x minus 14 times x minus 14. Now, could I multiply this out? I absolutely could. And then I could bring the 36 over to this side, and then I could use completing the square or the quadratic formula. It doesn't matter. You could do that. That is another way of doing this problem. I think it would make it a whole lot harder to square that out and get rid of the parentheses. So if I ever have a parentheses squared, and if I can take the square root of both sides, I will do that first. Now, yes, I could multiply this out and get rid of the parentheses. Absolutely. Now, some kids, they would just square the first, second term. I got rid of that. That's not true. You'd have to multiply x minus 14 times x minus 14. So the 6, does that make sense? That you could get rid of the parentheses first. You'll get the same answer, just going to make a whole lot more problems for you. Yeah, it would work. I mean, as I said, you want me to do it that way? I can do it, and we will get the same answer. It's just, so it's a little bit more complicated, because it probably won't even factor out at the end. So it is definitely a harder way. Yeah, I agree with you, Samantha. That is nice for multiple choice. All right, let's jump to problem number 3. Very similar problem, okay? Very similar. So I'm going to turn off my mic. I'm going to let you guys do this problem. Okay, see what you get for an answer. Very similar, but remember, be careful. When you do have your answer, just put it in the chat box. Oh, no. All right. I just worked out the problem, and I was very eloquent when I was explaining how to do it. All right. So I did problem number 3. I took the square root of both sides, and I ended up with p minus 1 is equal to the positive square root of 6, and p minus 1 is equal to the negative square root of 6. And then I just added 1 to both sides, and I ended up with the square root of 6 plus 1, or negative square root of 6 plus 1. So it is correct. Yeah, there's times where I forget to turn the mic on. Sorry about that, guys. All right. Number 4. Another problem, very similar, but I'm going to tell you. Could anybody tell me which answer could not be right? Okay, which one of those up there can't be right because there's something we know for sure? C. C cannot be right. Why? Because I'm going to take the square root right away, and I'm going to end up with the square root of a positive 4, which isn't going to be an imaginary answer. So C cannot be right for good. I mean, that one could be gone right off the bat. Number 3 was A. Yes. Yes, it was. Okay. So if I was going to do this problem here, I have 8s plus 9 quantity squared is equal to 4. It is isolated. The square is isolated because it's inside. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So I end up with 8s plus 9 is equal to positive 2. And then down here, or 8s plus 9 is equal to negative 2. So really now I just have 2 equations that I have to solve. I'm going to subtract 9 both sides here. So I end up with 8s equals negative 7. Divide through by 8. I end up with s equals negative 7/8. Okay, I'm going to subtract 9 off of here. And I end up with 8s equals negative 11. Divide through by 8, negative 11/8. Boom. Pretty straightforward. I mean, not bad at all. So that's letter D for my answer. Okay, so now we've gone through quite a few problems dealing with taking the square root, right? hopefully the next one deals with something different. All right, here we go. Now this, you can't solve this one by taking the square root of both sides. Why not? Because you got a 10, that negative, or that negative 10a there. So what are the other two methods that we have this week? Well, we could use the quadratic formula. That would work. Or we could use completing the square. Makes no difference which way you do it. I am going to work the problem out both ways. I'm going to do it completing the square. I'm going to do it using the quadratic formula. But I'm going to let you guys work for a couple minutes on your own, and I'm going to take attendance as you guys are working. So I will probably be off my mic for a couple minutes because it got 32 kids in here. It takes a while for me to check everybody's name off. Okay, so you guys work on it. When you get an answer, just throw it in the chat box, and I will be back after I have attendance taken. I will try to remember to turn the mic back on. Okay, I did not forget to turn on my mic. I just took me a while to take attendance. There's a couple kids that have been that were new before I took the or made up the Google spreadsheet, and then it's like, oh no, where is this person? It's like, oh, they're new. Awesome. Love to see all the kids in class. It makes it a whole lot nicer to be able to talk to kids when we're working. Now, I'm going to do this problem. I'm going to do it two different ways. I'm going to do it by completing the square first. Okay, so I've got a squared minus 10a minus 24 is equal to 0. So I'm just going to rewrite this as a squared minus 10a plus something is equal to, and then I'm going to move the 24 over there, plus something. What am I going to add and subtract from both sides? What am I going to add and subtract from, or I'm sorry, what am I going to add to both sides? Because I'm going to do it the same thing to both sides. I'm going to add 25 to both sides. Half of 10 is 5. 5 squared is 25. Okay. Now, when I factor this, there's a minus sign here, so it's going to factor to a minus 5 squared is equal to 24 plus 25, which is 49, which is awfully nice because that's a perfect square. Now I have it where I can take the square root of both sides. So I end up with a minus 5 is equal to 7. A minus 5 is equal to negative 7. I'm going to add 5 to both sides. A is equal to 12. I'm going to add 5 to both sides. A is equal to negative 2. So I end up with 5. Uh-oh. Something's wrong here. Did I make 12? Oh no, letter D. I didn't see. Oh, I was gonna say, oh no, I didn't see my answer up there. Okay, so that is completing the square. All right, so I'm gonna do the same thing. However, I'm going to use the quadratic formula. So I've got a squared minus 10a minus 24 is equal to 0. A is equal to 1. B is equal to negative 10. C is equal to negative 24. Negative b, so negative 10 is positive 10. Plus or minus the squared. Well, negative 10 squared is 100. Anytime you square something, you get a positive. Minus 4 times a times c. So that's going to be negative 76, is that? Negative 76? I think that's right. So I have a minus a negative, which is going to be positive, and I said 76, and I wrote that. All right, so I've got 10 plus or minus 176. That doesn't sound right. That's 96. So I end up with 10 plus or minus 196 over 2. Okay. What is the square root of 196? Is that 14? Okay. So now I have the square root of 196 is 14. So now I have 10 plus or minus 14 over 2. So I'm going to write it two different ways. I'm going to write it as 10 plus 14 divided by 2 and 10 minus 14 divided by 2. 10 plus 14 is 28. 28 divided by 2 is 14. 10 minus 14 is negative 4. Negative 4 divided by 2 is negative. Did I mess this up? That's 24. 10 plus 14 is 24. 24 divided by 2 is 12. Yikes. I better get the same answer regardless of which way I do the problem, right? It doesn't matter if you use completing the square, if you factored. Now, let's do the same problem factoring. Let's remember our factoring skills. Okay? What two numbers multiply to give us this but add up to this? Well, negative 12 times 2 is negative 24. Negative 12 plus 2 is negative 10. So this would be x minus 12, x plus 2. So that means my solution would be x equals 12, x equals negative. Now, you don't have to do factoring this way. It's not needed. But it would give us the exact same answer. So I get the same answer regardless if I factored, if I completed the square, if I did quadratic formula. All three methods work. I mean, you get the same answer regardless of which way you do it. However, remember on tonight's assessment, I do ask specifically methods on how to do it, okay? So if I say you need to use quadratic formula and if you just factor it, I'm not going to give you credit. I'm just going to put down, I'll be nice about it. I won't put down, don't you know how to use a quadratic formula? I'll just say, to get credit for this problem, you need a quadratic formula. Okay, I'll try to be. Does anyone do school at night? I do school all the time at night. Isn't 4 times 1 times negative 24 negative 96? It is. It is. But remember, it was 100, and that's a good question. But remember, it was 100 minus negative 96. So that really is 100 plus 96. Okay, so you got to be really careful there, because the quadratic formula is b squared minus 4 times a times c. So that would make it a positive. Okay. All right, let's go to problem number 6 on this week's practice. Number 6, we have z squared plus 12z plus 21. Which method do we want to use this time? Do we want to use completing the square, or do we want to use quadratic formula? So are they the same problems? Completing the square? Does completing the square always work? Okay, sometimes it's really hard to use completing the square because it doesn't always work. Factoring or quadratic formula always does. Okay, but the first person asked to do it completing the square, so we're going to complete the square. So if I was going to do this problem, I've got z squared plus 12z plus something is equal to, and right away I'm just going to move that 21 over here. So that's negative 21 plus something. What is the something that I'm going to add to both sides? What is the plus something? 36? I agree. And the reason? Half of 12 is 6. 6 squared is 36. So I'm going to add 36 to both sides. So I'm going to end up with z plus 6 quantity squared is equal to, what is that? 36 and 21. Is that 15? I think that's 15. Okay. So then I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Z plus 6 equals positive square root of 15. Square root of 15 doesn't break down, so I'm just going to leave it. And z plus 6 is equal to negative square root of 15. Well, my last step is just to subtract 6 off of both sides. So there's my answer. Now, I could have did 6 plus or minus the square root of 15. That also means the same thing. It's 6 plus the square root of 15 and 6 minus the square root of 15. So they have it written a little differently. Or was that minus? Oh, it was a minus sign. I'm sorry. That is not the correct answer. Don't look at that. I could have written it this way. Negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 15. So letter B would be the correct answer. Square root is approximately 3.8729. Yeah, but if you have a square root that doesn't break down, don't use your calculator and break it down. Just leave it as it is. Okay? Don't use that calculator. All right. Problem number 7 on this week's practice. Let's see what it is. Oh no, that's way too easy. All right. Which way would you guys do it? Do you guys like completing the square better than quadratic formula? Okay. And it makes no difference to me. I like completing the square when they're all like real nice numbers. Like if that middle number, like if that was if that 4x was 5x, I probably wouldn't use completing the square because what's half of 5? It's not even, is it? And then you got to square it. So you're going to end up with and then you have to square 2.5. That's not going to be nice. So completing the square when that number is not an even number, it's a little bit tougher. No question about it. Can it be done? Sure, it can be. But it does make it a little bit tougher. Okay? So you guys work on this one. Tell me what you get for an answer. Nobody's got an answer yet? Letter B? Okay, that's only one. Okay. Oh, we got a couple D's in there. Couple B's, couple D's. Your brain turned off. All right, that happens to me a lot of times. Usually when my wife's around. No. All right, I'm going to do completing the square here. So I've got x squared plus 4x plus something is equal to negative 20 plus something. Oh, I know right away that I'm going to be able to cross off this answer and this answer. Why do I know that? Why do I know that I can cross those off? Negative 20. That doesn't really tell me yet. I know it's going to have an I in the answer. Why do I know it has to have an I in the answer? Because when I take half of 4, I get 2. 2 squared is 4. I'm going to add 4 to both sides. Well, this is going to be a negative over here. So this is going to end up being x plus 2 squared is equal to negative 16. Well, when I take the square root, I'm going to end up with an I in my answer. So I'm going to take the square root here. I end up with x plus 2 is equal to 4i. I'm going to take x plus 2 is equal to negative 4i. I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. So I end up with negative 2 plus or minus 4i. I'm going to go with letter D for my answer there. Okay. Does that make sense? Kind of. It was a good problem. I mean, and those are the types of problems that, you know, because we're using some of the stuff that we learned last week. Whenever you have a negative square root, you have to make it an I. Well, some kids, they don't, you know, I know this week I'm going to get some kids, and I had this on last week's assessment. I had students putting down, as soon as there was a square root there, they're putting down no solution. It's like, I know you didn't come to the main lesson. Because if you came to the main lesson, you know that the whole week last week dealt with imaginary numbers. So whenever you have a negative number, it's not no solution, it is just an I. I feel like you didn't write something down. On this problem, to me, these would be my steps in this problem. Well, because I took the square root of x plus 2, that's going to be that, and then I end up with 4i. But then I wrote it two different ways. I did x plus 2 equals 4i and x plus 2 equals negative 4i. Oh, I always do that. Anytime I take the square root of something, I always write it as a positive and a negative, and then my last step was just to subtract 2 from both sides. I kind of was working all together because I always run out of room. Sorry about that. All right, let's go to problem number 8. Number 8, we have x squared plus 2x minus 120. Okay, now if I was going to do this problem, this one to me is completing the square. I've got x squared plus 2x something is equal to, then I move this negative 120 over, it becomes a positive 120. And I'm looking at this, and then I'm going to add something. I'm looking at this, and half of 2 is 1. 1 squared is 1. I add 1 here. Oh, that's 121. That's a perfect square. That makes it really nice, because now I end up with x plus 1 squared is equal to 121. Well, when I take the square root of both sides, lo and behold, square root of 121 is 11. So this is just going to be x plus 1 equals 11, or x plus 1 equals negative 11. Subtract 1 from both sides, I end up with x equals 10. Subtract 1 from both sides, I end up with x equals negative 12. Pretty awesome. I love these types of problems. I like using completing the square. I mean, I think completing the square is an easy thing to use, but as I said, it's not always easy. I mean, if that middle term was a negative, or not a negative number, but an odd number, makes it way harder. No question about it. All right, let's see what number 9 brings us. Number 9. Oh, somebody said, was this the same is this the same problem as number 6? It's easy until it's not. Yeah, and and I've been told this a lot, that, Mr. Shango, it's so easy when you're doing it on the board. You make it look so easy, and then I get to the assessment and I forget all the steps. I get it. I do. I've been doing this for a long time, guys. A long, long time. Like 37 years I've been teaching. So it's been a long time. So to me, it does come easily because I've been doing it for a long time. If you guys have been teaching math for 37 years, you look at these problems, you're like, oh, that's really easy. I get it. When I was in high school, it didn't come easy to me. I was not a very good math student when I was in high school. But, then I started doing it, and it's like, oh, it's not that bad. Thanks. I wish I was in my 40s. My daughter turns 40 this year, which is scary to think that my daughter is turning 40. Oh my goodness, I'm getting old. Yeah, my first words. Exactly. It was the quadratic formula. All right. Problem number 9. I don't know if this is the exact same one. It sure looks like it, doesn't it? I'm going to go z squared plus 12z equal to, we got this negative 21 plus something. Half of 12 is 6. 6 squared is 36. Yeah, this kind of seems like we did this one already. So this is going to be z plus 6 squared is equal to, what did we have, 15? Yeah, kind of looking familiar. So I end up with 2 plus 6, or I'm sorry, z plus 6 is equal to square root of 15 plus or minus. Subtract the 6 off, so negative 6 plus or minus square root of 15. Yeah, kind of looks like the last one we did, or a couple times ago. I picked D and it said it was wrong. On this problem right here, number 9, I do make mistakes on my answer keys. There's no question about it. Let me jump in real quick. This is week number 6, practice. Okay, so let me just jump in. As I said, I do make mistakes all the time. Number 9, you said you picked D? Yep, number 9, my answer key says it's B. That is absolutely not correct. So I'm going to jump in here. I'm going to change the answer to D. And then when I hit submit, it should recalculate everybody, and it should correct your answers. Okay? You mean like on my practices? I change my practices all the time, so so it's not always the same problems on my practices and my assessments. I'm sure next year, because this is my last year teaching, I'm sure next year the teacher will use the same ones, because when they get my classes, I'm sure they're not going to change them. No, yes. So, yeah, this is my last year. I've got I figure 37 years is enough. All right, we have one more practice problem today. That is problem number 10. Uh-oh. This one's a little bit tougher. Why is this one harder? Okay, why is this one harder? Would I use completing the square on this one? Yeah, exactly. That a value is 8y. Could you use completing the square on this? You could. It would not be easy. Okay, I'm going to tell you that right now. using completing the square would not be easy, because to use completing the square, you have to have a 1 in front of that y squared. Well, how do you get rid of that 8? You'd have to divide everything by 8. Well, you divide 22 by 8 and you divide 15 by 8, you're left with a lot of really hard numbers. I'm getting rid of completing the square. Not going to do it. So what's my next choice? Quadratic formula. Quadratic formula is, so my a value is going to be 8, which is not great, but that's fine. B is 22. C is 15. Okay, some pretty large numbers, but I can handle it. So negative b, so it's going to be negative 22 plus or minus the square root of 22 squared. I don't know what 22 squared is. So I'm going to multiply it out. All right, that's a lot of 4s. 484, I think, minus 4 times a times c. I should really keep a calculator on my desk, shouldn't I? that would really make it a lot easier. 480? It's not 484? 22 times 22? Or you're talking about 4 times 18 times, so that's 60 times 8, 480. Okay, so gotcha. So this is going to be 480, which really makes it nice, doesn't it? Because now, and then 2 times 8, or 2 times a, which is 16. So 484 minus 480, that gives me 4. Why is that nice? Because that's a perfect square. So now I end up with, I'm going to write it 2 different ways. Negative 22 plus 2 over 16, and negative 22 minus 2 over 16. Because remember, the square root of 4 is 2. So negative 22 plus 2, that's negative 20 over 16. And then negative 22 minus 2 is negative 24 over 16. Obviously, those answers aren't up there, so I have to simplify. I'm going to take 2 out of each one of these. So 2 out of 20, that's negative 10 over 8. Take 2 out again, that's negative 5 over 4. So negative 5/4 is a solution. And then here, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take 2 out. That gives me negative 12 over 8. Take 2 out again, that's negative 6 over 4. Take 2 out again, negative 3 over 2. Yeah, some kids will say, but Mr. Shanklin, why didn't you just take 4 out or 8 out in the beginning? I could have, but I'm lazy. I always just go by 2's. So negative 3/2 is another solution. So it looks like letter D is the correct answer. D is the popular answer this week, isn't it? So this week on your assessment, the first problem you have to solve by taking the square root of both sides. Problem number 2, you have to do by completing the square. Problem number 3 is correct formula, and problem number 4 is a word problem. So it's all right there. Last week on Wednesday, we had a help session, and 4 students came, and it was amazing. Some of the best questions ever. For those of you that have not come to a help session yet, for those of you that were at the help session, are any of you guys here today? Does help, doesn't it? I mean, it was, we went through just question after question after question, just answering students' questions. Some kids, they wanted me to do problems right off the assessment, and it's like, I can't do that, but I did problems similar, very similar to the ones on the assessment. And then it's like, oh, okay, that helps. Yeah, and if you're comfortable with the material, awesome. You don't have to come to the help sessions. Oh, I did I to the 66, didn't I? I did a few problems that were exactly the same, didn't I? But that is for the kids that come to the help sessions. All right, that is it for today. If you have any other questions, please stick around. If not, have a great day, and I hope to see you on Wednesday.